Okay. Oh, come on, sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody feeling? Good? I promise you're in the right conference. This is a software conference, but we are going to talk about empathy. So I have a really kind of odd path into software. If you were to observe me in my natural habitat, I'm a business person. I know, I heard some people, ooh. I love marketing. I love sales. That's my background. I have a degree in it, in marketing and business law. I spent years as a copywriter, right? So my job was naming things. That was my entire job. I loved it. And then in 2009, I went to my high school reunion. I ran into a friend, his name's Scott, and we were really good friends, and we were kind of catching up. And Scott told me, you know, I've been reading your blog about your ideas with marketing and sales and business, and they're really interesting to me because I'm starting a business. And he said, the other thing is that you may think that you're a business person, but you're actually a programmer. And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, all of your ideas and everything that you're talking about on your blog about how you can reuse and everything should be modular and you can put this and this here and you know the way that you focus on naming things, he's like, that is all the stuff that we're working on in software. He has a background in computer science. He was working at government and large corporations. And he said, there's this really interesting problem in software where we're trying to get business people and software engineers to actually talk to each other. He goes, started throwing out all these different things that didn't mean much to me at the time, Agile, XP, DDD. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. And then he goes, I want you to lead my company. Would you come on board and be my boss? It's like, hi, Scott. Yeah, so we, over the course of several months, kind of had different talks and different conversations about what that might look like. And eventually I said, you know what, I think this is something that's interesting to me. I've used software. I'm very interested in technology. I don't know how to code, but I'm interested in learning. And so one of the very first things that I did is, coming from a marketing background, the first thing I needed to do if I was going to lead this company, and right now, it was only Scott, right? He had been running this business for a year, and he had all of these great technical ideas, and he goes, I need someone to translate it so that people want to buy what I'm selling. I said, okay, what is it that you like to do? And this is called a value proposition in the marketing and business world, right? If you can narrow down everything that you do into kind of one singular statement, what would it be? And his answer was fixing legacy code. Genuinely, not a joke. This is his favorite thing in the world to do. He loves fixing bugs. He loves doing test-driven development. He loves everything that is associated with legacy code and transforming it and making it better. I didn't know anything about legacy code. If you guys were at the keynote this morning, we heard Eric and he was talking about how legacy has a different connotation in different contexts. In my context, legacy was always a good thing, right? Building my legacy, right? My grandfather's legacy. So I kind of had this idea of code, like, okay, legacy code is code that's really important. It's maybe been around, like other people worked on it, and now other people are kind of passing the baton. But what I discovered was that legacy code is ridden with shame. Scott was really almost ashamed to admit that he liked working on legacy code because there is this belief that the glory of software is in the making, is in the innovation, is in the green field. And to say that you like working on brownfield, or you like untangling big balls of mud, or you like kind of squashing out spaghetti code, people laugh at you, genuinely. So this was kind of what I was observing, was more of kind of the human interaction of kind of this whole space. And luckily, I knew a lot about the topic, and I knew kind of an idea of how I might be able to, lend a hand here. Because I was familiar with the work of Dr. Brené Brown. And in her book, Daring Greatly, Dr. Brown, she's a researcher from the University of Houston. And by researcher, I mean actual researcher, not somebody who's like, oh, I did this thing once, and then here you go. Right? It's very academic, very rigorous. And she focuses on shame, vulnerability, and empathy. That's the area of study for her. And in her book, Daring Greatly, she talks about how empathy is the antidote to shame. Shame cannot survive empathy. She gives this story of if you've got a whole bunch of shame in a petri dish, and you just leave it go, it's gonna grow, kind of like bacteria does. But if you were to take that same shame, douse it with empathy, it cannot grow. So I was like, okay, great. Scott, if we're gonna build this company, we kind of need to have empathy at the heart of it. So over the years, kind of about 4 or 5 years later, after I kind of started to understand the domain, Scott and I sat down and we said, okay, we're gonna develop some core values. And at the very heart, I was like, the very first one needs to be about empathy, right? Because of all this research and stuff. So we've got act with empathy, right? Adopt a growth mindset. That's from Carol Dweck and kind of her ideas around, fixed mindset and growth mindset. Calm the chaos, right? We want our prefrontal cortex to be working. We don't want to be working from kind of the limbic system. Communication is just as important as code, right? If we're writing in really any language other than assembler, we're actually writing for humans more so than we're writing for the machine. And then also craft in context. So the idea that you can't propose a technical solution without understanding the context in which that solution is supposed to help. So then we went to a business consultant to kind of help us craft this, and that's kind of what businesses do. And this business consultant told us, you can't use the word empathy in your core values because no one in software will ever take you seriously. And, at the time, that kind of felt true. So I changed act with empathy. I kind of removed it, and we toyed around for a couple of years. We used think of others. But I have since decided that empathy has to be said. Empathy matters. We sometimes think of empathy as this thing that exists. It's kind of like oil and water, right? Empathy is okay, and it can exist within this space, but it's really also outside of it, right? Empathy is for those marketing people. Empathy is for those feeling people, right? I'm a logic person. I'm an analyst. I'm an engineer. I don't bother with empathy. And so what we really needed here was an emulsifier, right? So just like if you're gonna make salad dressing, you use eggs or you use mustard or something and you shake it up, and everything then mixes together. And so that's kind of what we were looking for. I was like, how can I teach my engineers to really understand empathy? So the first thing was thinking about, well, what do people think of originally when we think of empathy? Normally we think of walking in someone else's shoes, right? That tends to be the very first kind of definition that comes to mind. Sometimes it's it's that immediate heartfelt connection with someone, right? And yeah, those are aspects of empathy, but it's not the whole story. So I started researching, what is empathy? I read all these different books. And one of the most profound and influential books that I read was by a woman who does a lot of work in the user experience community, and her name is Indy Young. And this is her book, Practical Empathy, and it is essentially a technical manual for empathy, right? It's wonderful. I recommend everyone in here pick it up and get it, right? She dives into a lot of really good stuff that is a good kind of expansion of this topic. And one of the first things I noticed was that she framed empathy, and this is consistent throughout Dr. Brown's research as well. Empathy is not something that you just inherently have. Empathy is a skill. Empathy is something that you acquire through practice. Just like All of us in this room didn't learn how to code straight out of the womb, right? Some of us maybe. But we didn't just kind of get born out of the womb and like know that this is empathy, right? It's a skill, we acquired it. And the way that we practice empathy is in two forms. First, it is developed by perspective taking, right? The nice thing about empathy is that it is rooted in research. It is rooted in understanding other people. And then there's a second step. It's applied by perspective taking. So it's developed, by listening and understanding, and it is applied by perspective taking. So listening and understanding, you're collecting that data, right? Applying it, you're taking that information that you've learned, and then applying it through perspective taking. There's also 6 different types of empathy, right? I would argue that anything that can be categorized into 6 different subtypes, like that approaches a technical topic, right? This goes deep. It's not just a random kind of feeling state. And the type of empathy that she really expands on in this book is cognitive empathy, which she defines as purposefully discovering the underlying thoughts and emotions that guide someone else's behavior. It is a rational and analytical process. Again, this isn't kind of an immediate feeling. This is something that you research, that you think through. So I started thinking this work, this particular book, was a really good kind of launch pad for how I might be able to encourage everyone on my team to use that core value of act with empathy, right? The first step is really understanding what it is. Another book that was influential was Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff. And I started researching Lakoff a little bit more, and he's got this great quote of empathy is at the heart of real rationality, right? If we want to truly be rational and make a good decision, we have to do what Indy said. We have to listen, right, first, and then apply that information to make a good decision, right? Otherwise, we're just doing assumptions. We're injecting our bias, right? We have to do our due diligence, and that's called empathy. So upon kind of getting my boundaries a little bit, kind of getting my feet wet, I started to realize that empathy is not the problem. The problem is silos, right? I know I am definitely not the first person at this conference to talk about silos, but this is exactly what problem I found, right? And this happened within my company when it was just 2 people, right? You can't get much more simpler than that. But Scott and I had immediately segmented ourselves into marketing, right? The reason I brought you on board, Andrea, is that you're really good with marketing, you're really good with sales, you're really good at describing things. Learn how to code, I'll help you, but that was kind of my domain, right? And then Scott was the engineering, like he did all the client services and he did all the coding. And what we noticed was that there are some underlying belief systems that come with that. So as the marketing person, I gave myself the belief, the internal dialogue of I'm good with people, right? I like sales, I love meeting new people, right? If anybody here has ever taken the Strengths Finder, from the Gallup, then, woo in meeting other people, breaking the ice, like that's one of my strengths. I really like it. Scott, on the other hand, would identify himself as good with machines, right? His top strength is restorative, right? He loves just sitting down, and putting his head between some headphones and, writing some code. To him, that is just glory. He loves it. But then we also have the reverse a little bit, right? We've got these kind of positive connotations around what we're good at. But then there's these kind of shadow sides of it, which is, well, I'm good with people, but I'm bad with machines, I have struggled very, very much with this idea of imposter syndrome of I'm never going to learn everything in technology and how to code, so therefore I don't belong here, right? And Scott, on the other hand, he internalized this as, oh, I'm bad with people. And that was reinforced by different messages. He had people who said, you don't have social skills, and he just kind of internalized this. But that's not true at all. Scott's very caring and very kind, and like, I didn't observe any problems with his social skills. It was more of an internal belief system. So what we need to do is kind of break down these silos, right? Instead of either or, this is a false dichotomy. I am good with people, and I'm definitely learning about the machine side, right? Feel pretty comfortable in JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and I learned how to code and worked on definitely those first clients. I'm always learning more. And Scott, at the same time, he's good with machines, and he's crossing over into the people domain, learning how to speak, helping to write for our website, writing blogs, communicating more. Like, we need to get people to talk to each other. But this was the real challenge. How, right? We were speaking completely different languages, and it took us years to really understand each other. And on some levels, we still don't. One thing I forgot to mention is that after running the business for a few years, we eventually got married. So at that point, I was like, I really need to learn this stuff. And in some levels, that really helped us because we liked being around each other, and we had enough respect for each other where we were going to really try to figure this stuff out. But had this been kind of more of a truly professional relationship that never blossomed into anything else, I may have left because this problem was really hard. So thinking through this, we started hiring staff. I really wanted our engineers to understand what empathy was. And so I started thinking, how can I model out my experience as a writer, as a business person who understands the process of trying to get in someone else's head and understand what their motivations are and then apply that. How can I do that to help them feel empowered? The goal here was to kind of take the best of both worlds, right? I wanted to, there definitely is this feeling state of knowing that you're helping someone, feeling connected because you're learning more about somebody. That on some level feels really good. But I wanted to kind of open it up, right? So that the people on my team could see all the inner workings, because that's the way that they view the world, right? Just have empathy. That's not going to satisfy them, right? They want to see all the details. So I was like, okay, how can I do this? So I decided to kind of think about an algorithm. I knew that I went through sort of a process to execute empathy, if you will, right? And so I was like, that's a process that's very procedural. It's kind of like a recipe that I pull up. I felt like I had kind of this mental method in my brain that I just called. And so I wanted to try to define that in a way. But I quickly discovered that I had an expert problem. How many people, when they're talking to their domain experts, run into that they don't even know how they do things? Yeah? This is a challenge, right? Because to me, it was like I was just kind of so used to it, right? But the way that we kind of overcame that was taking good notes, right, and slowing down. Luckily, our calm the chaos core value really served us well here. So just thinking through, taking some deep breaths, and plotting out kind of how we do this. So we set things up within a context of creating a communication artifact, right? And the reason I use artifact is because an artifact is something that you're intentionally leaving behind so that other people can do great work after you, right? Archaeologists rely on artifacts, right? There are artifacts in our code that help other people understand our thinking. And that can be everything from writing an email, to coding up a unit test, to creating a user story, delivering some kind of analysis or report, or even presenting at a conference. So I came up with this kind of 6 different rough steps, right? So first thing that I do is like kind of identify who I'm talking to, right? I understand the target audience, and I'm working on writing to kind of one specific person. And then I think about their context a little bit. I think about what they need. And then I think about kind of what's the best action, what's feasible, right? So in my business studies, there's a lot of feasibility analysis, right? That's a big thing. And then finally, I create some artifacts, right? So that was kind of the basic outline. But then we had to go deeper, right? We had to dig in a little bit. So step one is really identifying the individuals. And the way that I was trained to do this, and I think it kind of feels intuitive, is you start with kind of the big group, right? You start by thinking of kind of the broad audience that you want to talk to. So if this were kind of event storming, this is looking at the bigger picture, right? Then you kind of carve out a subdomain a little bit, right? So I think about the role, right? So instead of going from stakeholder, right? That's not going to help me form a connection, right? Instead, it's like, okay, the CFO, right? A specific role. But then, in order, like as a copywriter, I was trained to go even one step deeper. I don't want to talk to the CFO, I want to talk to Jamal, right? I want to have a picture of Jamal, and when I'm writing, I want to know that like Jamal is the person that I am writing this thing for. And then naturally, I form that connection, right? One of the tools in kind of the marketing and user experience world that we do to kind of help this is personas, right? And these are useful, right? But understanding kind of which context it in. So this is kind of an example, you know, this is LaTanya, she's a manager, these are all of the different beliefs. And I think the important thing about personas is that they should be rooted in research, right? It's not very useful just to say this and kind of say, oh, well, I assume that this is what LaTanya means, or you know, it's rooted in research. So the next step is thinking through the context, right? And by context, I mean, what is the situation that this individual finds themselves in? Because I'm a business owner, right? A world traveler. I'm also a mom, right? So if you want to market to me as a mom, that's going to be very different from a business traveler, but I'm the same person, right? The context that I exist in makes a big difference. So how are they feeling? You know, what are they likely to do? What have they tried in the past? Again, you will hear me say this over and over again. This should be rooted in research, should not be assumed. So again, you know, kind of, you've got one person, same person, but if they're preparing to run a marathon, they're going to feel very differently than if they're going to a funeral, right? And you need to consider that context because the same person can be in multiple situations. Next was really thinking through this person's needs, right? Preferences, values, goals. How do they like to receive information? What does success look like to them? You know, what's going to reduce their stress? Again, research instead of making assumptions. And the tools here that I relied on in my marketing world were things like empathy maps. So we're familiar with design thinking. That came out of the Stanford Design School, the D School. And empathy maps are another kind of product of that, right? So in the Stanford model, which is the one with the colors up there, you're thinking about quotes and defining words, actions and behaviors, thoughts and beliefs, and then also feelings and emotions. And you're mapping all these things out, sticky notes on a board. So then that way it gives you a better sense of what that person is thinking and feeling. And then here's another popular one that I just see all over the place. I couldn't find the person to credit it with, but again, it's kind of like you've got that one person, but there's a lot of different aspects. There's thinking and feeling. What do they hear? What do they say? What do they do? What's their pain? As a writer, as a marketer, we spend a lot of time thinking about people's pain. what's the benefit that they're going to get, right? Another tool for really understanding how people are on a deeper level is mental models, which again is Indy Young. So she wrote mental models first and then wrote practical empathy later. But again, this is incredibly detailed and technical stuff, right? That I would encourage you to read, but it really helps us think through how to understand other people. Indy, out of that, kind of a summary of what she calls listening sessions, which are ways to gather that information. You're looking for 3 things. Reasoning, what is somebody's kind of thought process as they're going through something? Reactions, I'm in this situation, how am I likely to react? Am I going to be stressed? Am I going to be calm? What reaction am I going to have? And then their guiding principles. So what's my personal value system, right? And mapping all that out in different areas, and it's cool to kind of look at all the different tables. It gets pretty complex. Next is step 4 in our algorithm. So at this point, we were thinking through less about the audience and starting to think more towards the solution, right? We're moving from the data gathering phase into the application phase. And so we started to think through what, in kind of my framework of when I was writing and I was, kind of developing this, I was thinking about what's the blue sky, right? What is the ideal solution? If we had no limits, what would we do? No constraints. Everything is rainbows and sunshine and fairy tales, and a lot of people get stuck here. It's a fun place to live, right? But it's important because we're thinking all the way through what's the best case scenario. And then we put on our kind of pessimistic hat and we start thinking about, but what can we actually do, right? That's a really good kind of place to be. In an ideal world, we would do all that. What can we deliver today? What can we ship today? What is the next best thing that I can do, given, if I'm, usually you have one of 3 constraints: time, money, skill. I don't know if you guys can see, but the poor person here did not have a lot of skill in target practice. So what is it that you're lacking, right? That can often help kind of inform the feasibility of something. Next, we want to actually produce the artifact, right? So if it is a presentation, right, we deliver that thing, right? We deliver that email. We write that unit test, right? And the important thing is that we've applied everything that we've learned, right? There's a lot of kind of data gathering that goes through this. And I think similar to TDD or other practices, this can feel slow at first, but as you get more information, the process becomes much faster, right? To the point where it just becomes your natural way of working. But then there's a really interesting kind of thing that as we were thinking through how we do this, we realized there's actually another step. After you deliver, you think through what are the different other artifacts that have emerged from this process. And then you run through that process recursively. So you take one of those artifacts that kind of is a secondary artifact, and you run through the whole process again, steps 1 through 6. And the reason that we do this is because every single artifact, every single communication artifact that you create, whether that's writing a line of code, sending a Slack message, communicating with someone, anything that causes you to interact with a person, and you deliver on that, it builds trust. And so as we were kind of exploring this, I was informed by another story in Brené Brown's book about the way that we build trust is kind of like putting marbles in a jar, right? I deliver a test and it helps you do your job better, it's like a marble in the jar, right? And so we trust the people, right? Every time that I do something that I say I'm gonna do, or I'm a friend to you, or you tell me you had a rough day, and I'm like, I get it, that's hard, right? That's putting marbles in the jars of the people that we're interacting with. And what I think of is, legacy code is really code without marbles in the jar. Legacy code, to me, I know, Michael Feathers wrote his great work working effectively with legacy code, and in there he defined it as code without tests, which I think is amazing and true, and then also, in my world, not complete. Because tests are kind of one aspect of trust. Do you trust the system? But there's also, do you trust the people on your team? Or do you badmouth them and tell them that they wrote really crappy code, right, behind their back? When we want to run and look at kind of who worked on a piece of code last, the command that we use is called git blame. This is so baked into our culture that we don't even consider it. So how do we build trust in our systems, right? And to me, empathy is the fastest way to do it, because empathy works kind of like fission. I think of it as trust fission, right? And those of you who like physics, kind of like I do, fission is a way to just get massive amounts of energy really quickly, right? So if we want to inject massive amounts of trust onto our team, we need to focus on empathy. And we need to focus on delivering communication artifacts in an empathetic way. Because what happens is you have your primary communication artifact, right? So that's the thing that we were kind of working on. So in our context, we'll say like an email or something, right? But then from that, we're like, oh, you know what? This thing over here would actually really help. I explained this once, but I'm probably going to have to use this description again. I think I'll put it over in a wiki or over in our documentation so that other people might use it, right? That's a secondary artifact. And just like fission, you get a byproduct, and that byproduct is trust. The other neat thing about this is that you're not creating more documentation than is actually needed for a project. You're not sitting down and thinking like, oh, well, here's all the big things that we could do, because in this process, you've got that feasibility analysis, right? You have an algorithm piece in there that talks about why it's important to say, okay, this is what I can deliver immediately. So you're not necessarily creating all this documentation for documentation's sake. It just becomes very emergent. So again, we kind of look at this and we started kind of figuring out, well, how can we model this even deeper? And so we found kind of two subdomains within this process, right? And so the first is audience, right? So steps 1 through 3 are really all about understanding our audience, right? First, we're figuring out who our audience is and narrowing down into a very specific way where I'm not thinking about CFOs or the CFO. I'm thinking about Jamal, who is the CEO that I can, kind of learn about, right? And I can picture his face when I'm writing. And even if you don't know that person, that's where personas come in, right? Kind of a synthesis of the research. But you can imagine that person's face. You're defining their needs. You're figuring out kind of what the context is that they're in. But then you've got the action side, right? So, this is kind of mirroring Indy Young's definitional way, You're gathering information first, you're developing it first by learning about your audience, but then you're actually applying that knowledge through perspective taking, right? So you're thinking through what's the best action for this person? What's the feasible action for this person? And then you're delivering artifacts and then creating secondary ones. So, we started seeing, well, maybe we can put this into like a situation. So I'll give you kind of a little overview of how this might work in a relatively real life setting. And so this is a chart that kind of we started now that we've got this information. here's a chart that might be useful for people who are just now starting to learn about how to do this process. So the first thing we do is we figure out our audience, right? So the context, the bounded context that we're working within here, our primary communication artifact is that we are writing an error message for a bookkeeping app, right? So that's kind of the situation. All right, so we're imagining that, I am a developer or you are a developer and you have been tasked with writing this error message. The reason I pick error messages is because I think they have a lot of room for improvement. And this is how we get there, right? It was like my entire career, I really just want to fix error messages. Like, how can I teach everybody to write their error messages? Well, it starts here. So the first thing we do is we think about, okay, who's going to be using this? So we might go, oh, it's the user. What have we done wrong? Yeah, who's the user, right? Anybody here named user? There might be one person. I haven't met anybody named user. But that doesn't give us that connection. That doesn't give us the information that we need to really kind of think through what does this person need. So we don't use user. Instead, we say, okay, I'm going to move to kind of a piece of our persona, so there's a role. So this person, based on the research that we've done and kind of knowing who uses our application, this is a freelance artist. Our bookkeeping app, let's assume, really targets, freelancers or people who are working in the gig economy, and it makes it really easy for them. So we know that this is kind of an audience that's going to be receptive, and we've done some research, and kind of the person who represents our audience is someone named Malik. And now we have a connection. Now we can kind of sync up and start that process. But then we don't stop there, right? Because we think through who else, what other audiences are going to be useful. It's never just one. Well, I would say it's rarely just one. I always avoid never and always, always. So we think through, my customer success manager, her name's Tiara. And if I fix this user error, she might want to know about it, right? Because the way that she's communicating to the people who are calling in or emailing about, kind of the product, my work is going to impact her role in kind of her workday. And then my favorite is your future self, right? This is that self-empathy piece of the 6 different types of empathy. We need to consider ourselves. Think about, what does you 6 months from now need to prevent that dreaded state where you pull up some code but you have no idea what you did or who even did it, or worst case, you run git blame and are cursing whoever did it and you were like, oh, that was me, right? So now we've identified kind of the very specific people that we're targeting. So next we think through their contexts, right? And we do this for every single one. So the context of Malik, kind of, he's using it on the go, right? He's a freelance artist, so he's meeting with agents and he's at galleries and he's very rarely at a desktop using this, right? And we know this from the research. So that's going to matter, right? Because the user, he's feeling distracted regularly. And so that's going to change kind of our perspective and kind of what we deliver. We think about, Tiara, and what does she need? Well, she's responding to support tickets. That's her context. And there's a lot of pressure to reply quickly and have it be really accurate, right? That's the thing that she cares about. And then you're fixing a bug, but it's been 6 months since you looked at the code, right? That's kind of the context. So within that context, what does Malik need? He needs resolution, right? Worst thing is in the middle of something, I get an error and it just says error, 1541. And you what do I do with that, right? That might be useful for you, the developer. Is it useful for Malik, who's on the go and can't, send an invoice? No, that's blocking him, right? So that's going to inform you when you actually go to deliver this communication artifact. The customer success manager, what does Tiara need? She needs really accurate information, and she needs it to be really quick, and she needs to be able to call it up really quickly. And then the developer, what do you need, right? 6 months from now. Minimal context switching, right? You don't want to go like hunting through all the code and kind of figuring out, and you want to be able to just dive in and see what you need as quickly as possible. It needs to be really easy to understand. So now we have a good sense of kind of who our audience is, and now we move over into the actions section of our algorithm. So we imagine that for Malik, the best action, the blue sky, rainbows, puppies, and sunshine, right, is that we validate his frustration. It's written, if you do nothing else, right, in the second person active voice for error messages, right? And that means that you're using the word you. You're talking to a human. When we're writing error messages, we are writing for people, not for machines, right? And the active voice is, I'm doing this thing now. It's not in the future, it's not in the past, it's right now, right? And then maybe a link to a video tutorial, right? Other people have experienced this, there's this highly produced, amazing thing. That would be just glorious if we had that, right? That would exceed Malik's expectations, right? We imagine Tiara, like, what's the best thing that we could possibly deliver for her, right? If we were gonna just make her day where she was so, so grateful for what we delivered, she's like, if I had reference code in the error message, then I could update, and we could update our response library, right? That Tiara relies on this response library. So she wants to make sure that she can quickly see what is linked to what, so that when she's talking to Malik, who might call in, she knows what's going on the development team, on the development side. And then for you, what do you need? Well, you want to fix all the bugs, right? This is the challenge that Scott falls into, right? He sees one bug and he wants to figure out another one, and it becomes addictive, and that sometimes isn't always practical, right? We've got budgets and knowing that. Next, we think through, okay, what can we actually do, right? Given time and budget and kind of I've got other things that I need to work through, kind of what's something that I can deliver relatively quickly in 2 to 3 minutes? It's not going to necessarily knock me out of flow. It's not necessarily going to interrupt, right? And it's one of these things like, writing a test first, writing a failing test first. Yes, it takes a little bit extra time, but at the same time, it delivers so much value later after you've kind of accumulated a lot of these. So we think through, kind of what's something that I can deliver in the next, 3 to 5 minutes that would preserve some kind of intention of the best case scenario, but I'm not actually going to do the best case scenario, right? So for Malik, we definitely want to validate that frustration. That doesn't take a lot of time, right? We can write our error message in second person, in active voice. That doesn't take a lot of time. There's nothing kind of extra that we have to do around that. And then, the idea of a video tutorial seems good. So, your team has a backlog of just kind of blue sky ideas, so you just kind of toss it in there, right? Because that's what you're able to get done, and it still preserves that idea. Then you think through, okay, now Tiara, what can I do for her? Well, you create, that issue to document the reference code idea, right? You're not actually able to deliver it today, but again, documenting the idea of it becomes important. And then for yourself, you can fix edge cases, when they arise, right? So you're kind of focused on the happy path. That's kind of what people need you to do. You've identified that there are areas where absolutely it would be useful, but we have so few people who are actually calling in about that it doesn't really make a lot of business sense to automate that. We'll do it manually. And just, kind of being okay with that. So last step is thinking through what are the secondary artifacts that arise out of this. These are the extra things that you can deliver. And so, in the secondary artifact, it's a wiki update. Like I said, updating that wiki takes under 2 minutes. adds a lot of trust on your team, right? Shows that you're being proactive. You know, for the reference code, writing up a GitHub issue, right? That's what your team uses. You notice that it would be useful. You don't actually have to implement it. But again, just documenting it and saying, this is something that I've noticed and I think it might be useful, sharing it with the team. And then finally, you know, for yourself, writing clean code, right? Writing code that's self-revealing. Tests would be useful, right? Help you get context later. Writing a clear commit message. There's this thing called a description in the commit message area. So I have a friend, Dave Bach, and he says that a commit message, the message itself, should be the size of a tweet, and the description should be a blog post if necessary. And the reason that commit messages are so useful is because they're tightly coupled with the code itself. So, you know, preserving as much of that intent in your commit message is a really useful tool when you're going back to try to get context. And possibly doing a journal entry. This is something that we do on our team. We, you know, out of this experiment and kind of thinking through empathy, you know, in the Apollo mission, one of the things that engineers did is they kept really detailed notebooks with them because they were moving all across in all different teams and they were trying to share information. And a big piece of that was taking very detailed notes of what they had learned so that they can share it with other people. So we started that practice. We just have a wiki page and, you know, everybody has it and everybody writes, you know, 10, 20 minutes at the end of the day, a reflection, what did I do that day? And there's a developer on our, on our team named Steve, and he always writes in his journal, like, thanks, past Steve, right? Because he's been in this habit of doing this now that he's really starting to realize the benefits. He's documented, like, oh, I ran into this really interesting architectural problem. I don't have the time to deal with it now, but this is how I would deal with it if I could. He's preserving that thinking, and then he runs a search, and he's like, oh, you know, 6 months later, when he actually has that on his plate, he can go and he can refer to the context really quickly. So the way, you know, I know that domain-driven design, it's a big part of that is kind of coming up with these shared and ubiquitous language, right? And that is the process that emerged out of, you know, this very ongoing process that we're doing to really explore how can we use empathy on a very technical level, right? For us, the idea of audience and action as a framework works. Right? It's something that's easy to use, it's easy to understand. Everybody on our team kind of gets it and knows it. And the way that we describe empathy, kind of coming up with all this synthesis, but the way that we describe empathy is that it is proactive perspective taking. You're not waiting for somebody to, you know, share their perspective with you. You're going out and you're seeking it. And you're asking people, what do they care about? You're doing that research ahead of time so that you're informed. And then it's problem solving, which, good for us, engineers are natural problem solvers. This is a wonderful thing. And so when we frame it this way, you know, that empathy at its root is about collecting data about how to best interact with people and then doing it, solving that problem. This becomes an incredibly technical skill that is far removed from the just have empathy kind of people that I used to be. So I like to close with this quote from Arthur C. Clarke, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And this is how I felt about software when I first started this industry, when I first joined Corgi Bytes. I had no idea. It seemed like magic. I didn't know how stuff compiled. I used software, but like, it really felt like magic behind the scenes. And empathy can feel that way. I think that this can kind of be expanded a little bit as well. I like expanding definitions. Where it's not just technology. It's a process that's abstract and you don't understand it. And so can you apply algorithmic thinking and explore other areas that seem magical? And the reason they seem magical is because you haven't explored it. And digging in and looking at that process can actually uncover some of the more technical and rational and analytical processes that are underneath. So I would encourage you to kind of take this forth, enjoy your new empathetic journey. Everyone here has the capacity. One of the questions I get asked is, well, what about people who just don't have empathy? The research shows that unless you're a sociopath, like a clinical sociopath, which I hope you're not at this conference if you're in that situation, but very, 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 very few people have that. So you have empathy. You have that capacity inside you. And my challenge to you is to start exploring this in a way that is curious, in a way that's empowering, just like these processes of TDD and BDD and DDD, with that same enthusiasm. And I look forward to hearing how this has impacted you in the future. Thank you very, very much. And I think we've got some time for questions.
We have, thank you. Huge thanks to Andrea. Has anybody got any questions? We've got the mic over here.
Don't be shy.
Is there anybody up in the rafters we can't see? Okay, if we have...
Oh, there's one.
Just there. Good spots.
So when you have a conflict, how much empathy do you need to give?
Yeah, conflict, right? So if anybody's read Lecione's book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, conflict can actually be really healthy on a team, right? And so kind of the other side of empathy is the idea of candor, right? Kim Scott has done a lot of work in kind of radical candor. So being able to actually say what we think, transparency, that's really useful. And so in a conflict situation, which is really just two people not agreeing, which is useful, practicing empathy and saying, okay, how do you really feel, right? Running through this, like, what do you need? What do you value? That's a great opportunity to explore underlying causes. Because a lot of times when people have a conflict, there's kind of a surface level conflict, but then there's a deeper level conflict that may not be exposed. And so running through this process of, exploring if somebody has a conflict with you, saying, how can I understand you better, right? That's the practice of empathy. And then how can I help you solve this problem? And then eventually, that builds trust, and the conflict kind of goes away, and we start learning how to work together a little bit better and have dissent, but sometimes without the hurt feelings. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Cheers.